When I was in my mid-20s, I had a job that I enjoyed quite a bit, and it honestly paid decently. Basically, without getting into details, I would drive all over the state delivering medications to people that couldn't otherwise pick them up from a pharmacy for one reason or another. The work aspect of the job was straightforward, if not a little boring. It was the driving part of the job that I loved. I'm someone who absolutely adores podcasts of all type, and because my day was spent mostly driving, I would just devour hours of content. Some may find that boring, but for me, that was like a dream job. One day I had to make a delivery that was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, quite literally, there was nothing nearby. I passed by a small handful of farms, and that was pretty much it. The closest town was probably 30 minutes away at least. I eventually pulled up to this shack that was barely eligible to be considered even a home, I would say. It was honestly sad, but the guy didn't seem to care too much. I dropped off his medication and started my long journey back to civilization. My next drop was over an hour from this location, so I knew that I was going to get a nice chunk of podcast in. The first hiccup came when I was leaving the man's house. I had no service at all, so I couldn't put the new address into my GPS, and worst of all, I couldn't load any podcasts. I looked at the route that morning before I started my trip, and I believed that I had a general idea of where to go, just I wasn't confident. I started in the direction that I thought was the correct way and hoped for the best. While driving, I enjoyed the sunshine cooking me through the windshield. Every few minutes, I would check my phone to see if any service came back, but it was still no use, unfortunately. And then came hiccup number 2. While I was driving down a long, empty road of nothing, I must have hit something on the road because I slightly lost control for a brief second and I had a flat tire, which was just perfect. I got out to change the tire and of course hiccup number 3 came. There was no spare tire in the trunk. And at this point, I was feeling like crap. I had no idea where I was, no service on my phone, and now I had a flat tire on the side of the road. The only silver lining here was that it was beautiful outside. Something about the thought of being stranded on the side of the road in the middle of the night seemed scary, but this seemed peaceful, being stranded on such a beautiful day. I sat on the side of the road for a while, tried to figure out what to do. I didn't know if I should walk until I saw a farm or a town. And the problem is, if I walked, I would have to leave the vehicle and had a lot of sensitive material in the car. I thought about maybe just sitting there until maybe someone would drive by that I could eventually go get help. But that seemed unlikely since I saw maybe 2 cars since I got to this area. I wrestled with the idea for a while and then a small miracle happened, or at least at the moment I considered it a miracle. A car drove by, and when he saw me on the side of the road, he pulled over. There was a bigger man who got out of the car and started making his way over to my vehicle, and in a soft but very deep voice the man said, "Looks like you could use a hand." I explained the situation about not having a spare or any cell phone service, and the man just chuckled and said, "Yeah, phones don't really work around here. If you want, I can give you a lift to my place and you can call someone. It's only a few more minutes up the road." Now, ordinarily, I would never agree to do something like that, but at this point, I was honestly desperate. I locked up my car tight and decided to leave everything in the car, figuring that it would be safe for a little while I was gone. I agreed and I got into this random, kind gentleman's car. And the first thing I noticed was the horrific smell. It smelled like the man hadn't showered in 50 years. The car itself was also filthy. Trash and cans lined the floor of the car. As the man started driving, I looked down and noticed the cans at my feet were beer cans, which didn't make me feel safe. I just kept telling myself that this man was helping me and I needed to be nice. A few minutes later, we pulled up to a barn that looked like it was falling apart. It had a silo, at least I think that's what they're called, those big cylinder things that barns have, and the silo had a giant hole in it. The barn itself was falling over. The roof looked partially caved in, but the most glaring thing I noticed was that there was no farmhouse at all. It was just this old barn. Before I could say anything, the man said, "Phone's just inside there, son. Make your call, and I'll take you back." I opened the door and took a few steps towards the barn. I'm not sure what was running through my head at that moment that had caused me to believe that this barn had a phone. Maybe it was leaving that rundown shack at my last stop, or maybe I was just an idiot. But either way, I started to slowly make my way to the barn. When I was a few steps away from the car, I turned around and the man looked like he was sneaking out of the car, but his eyes seemed to be just oddly fixated on me. When I turned and looked, he sort of had this deer in the headlights look, but he stopped moving for a moment, and he just uttered these words. "It's just inside the barn. Just over there on the left." I slowly started to turn my head back towards the barn, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw that the man was reaching into his glove box. I looked forward at the barn, and I was close enough now to see that the inside of the barn was just completely empty, abandoned. My instincts kicked in, and I realized that something bad may be about to happen. Without thinking, I just decided to run. As I took off, I looked behind me, and the man was inches from where I was just standing. He had a large, blunt object in his hand that I think was some sort of pipe, but I couldn't be sure. I just kept running, trying to keep my distance from the road, my heart about to explode. Thankfully, it was so sunny that I could actually see where I was going, and I finally ran far enough that I got service on my cell phone. I was able to call the cops and try to explain to them where I was, and I tried to give them a brief description of the man and his car and everything that was happening. I didn't think it was a good idea, but the police told me to carefully make my way back to my car, which I did reluctantly. I was able to get there, and the police were already there, but thankfully the man wasn't. I gave my statement and told them exactly where the man took me. Unfortunately, the man's car or description didn't match any of the folks that lived in the nearby areas, and they seemed to be pretty familiar with everyone. We got my car towed, and the day ended at that moment. As far as I know, the police never found this man, but honestly, it seemed like they didn't care too much when I was giving my statement. Thankfully, I'm sitting here today able to tell this story, but if I didn't run when I decided to run, I could have found myself in a very much different situation. Every time I drive by a barn now, I'm reminded of that horrible afternoon. It just goes to show, sometimes monsters don't always hide in the shadows of night and can lurk even on the brightest of sunny days. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.